Hi everybody, I'm here to talk to you about big money and how it's putting open source at risk. Let me start with a quick introduction. My name is Matt Yankovic. I am the head of open source strategy, or the HOSS for short, at Percona. You can reach me on Twitter at myankovic or email me at hoss@percona.com if you have questions or want to talk further about these topics. So I wanted to start with this quote from Steven Spielberg. Everyone loves a winner, but nobody loves a winner. And this is never more true than in the business space. Everyone wants to copy a winner. Everyone wants, to chase those people who are successful, even those that start out hating one another. Think about Microsoft. Microsoft famously came out back in the 90s and said that Linux is a cancer and open source is bad for business, right? It was something that there was a lot of hate. And even today, people still remember those. But if you look at Microsoft today, open source has been a winner and Microsoft has jumped on the bandwagon. It's similar across the industry. People love open source because it's a winner. But this means it is a very dangerous time for open source because you're looking at people who are imitating but don't have the same philosophies that a lot of us who got into the open source space started with. So let's take a look at that. So when we talk about the big risk, it's really driven by commercial open source software. And the big risk that I see here starts with who this software is being built for. When you think about your project, something that you started with, something that's near and dear to your heart, you start by thinking, who is it being developed for? Maybe you're developing it for the world. Maybe you're developing it for maybe your local community, maybe people who think like you or act like you or use the same software as you, have the same issues. Or maybe you're looking at a certain specific set of users. There are people you want to reach, people you want to help. Okay? But most commercial open source software right now is being built for shareholders. Okay, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it makes you have to wonder what they're going to do and how they're going to proceed with, the future of their decision-making process around open source. And the success for a shareholder is very different than a lot of those that are in the community or those that started the project, right? If you think about the different sides of success, they have different outcomes. One is very for profit, the other one's very for the good of the community or the world. And part of the challenge is a classic open source model for businesses is very difficult. I can go into the details ad nauseum, but I only have 15 minutes here, so I'm going to keep it short. So when I say it's not easy, I've been in the open source business for over 20 years now. And, when you look at what drives open source companies, what, makes them profitable, okay, you have to remember that open source as a movement, in a lot of people's minds who are buying, who are consuming it, it changes how they buy. We did a survey this past year, and almost 2/3 of companies who use open source prefer not to pay. So if you're building an open source company, the large majority of your users don't want to pay. And the third of those that do pay, right? So you already cut down from 2/3 to 1/3. Now 1/3 of those that are paying are only paying for insurance and support. So they want, to get it just, because maybe something bad happens and you hope that you'll never use it. And these types of things enable, companies, the profits, the sales, these types of support contracts enable a lot of companies to be in business. But if people are predisposed never to use them, never to want them, they don't have as much value as, quote unquote, proprietary software licenses. And that makes retention rates often in open source companies a big problem, especially those that are focused on the service side of things. And anytime that you start to move towards a more commercial model, there's always risk that you're going to get forked. There's always risk that people are going to go away if they don't see, the impact of your software, and if they don't see the value, and if they're only buying it for support, if they never have that support need, eventually they're not going to see a need to pay for it. Now, in the space we're in, we have extra challenges. I'm in the database space. Databases are uncool. So not only do you have the open source stuff, you have, the challenges with people not wanting to pay, and it's not a cool space to pay for stuff. But when you look at how this all kind of started, go back to MySQL, which is one of the original OGs or old, companies that kind of set the benchmark for exits okay, and big money in the open source space. And again, everyone wants to copy this success. So open source now became this legitimate business model. It became something that transcended, if you will, just being that movement. And now open source is really the rule. This, is a quote from an article, on Linux Foundation. It has become that de facto standard where people are now looking first to develop open source, but they're not doing it as a community effort. They're not doing it as a means to help the world or move things forward. A lot of them are using it as a marketing investment or a way to, push, future monetization, generate a freemium model, if you will. And that's because how investors think is they get excited by adoption, right? And so they look at an open source project and they look at, oh my God, look at the number of downloads they have. Look at the number of, issues that people have opened. Look at the number of people who have contributed. And they look at those user numbers and their eyes bug out. They get really big. And then they think, but these guys don't know how to monetize this. They don't know how to turn this into a quote unquote real business. And so they try to find out how to take what you started as a project, something that has been driven by the community for the betterment of the world, and they think, how can I monetize this thing? And so they do. And so they start to invest in different areas, including things that, hey, we need stickiness, which is a fun way of saying, kind of locking you in. And there is this fine line between stickiness and lock-in, but ideally what you need if you want to be true to the open source roots is stickiness by treating customers and users right and showing them a lot of value. But it's not easy to do that. So a lot of investors go into the stickiness that is quote unquote lock-in, right? When you start using something and you can't get out of it, right? You don't want to be in the Hotel California space. You don't want to be locked in and can never leave. And this is where a lot of big open source or quote unquote open source companies, have chosen to play. If you look at, for instance, MongoDB, their CEO famously said, we did not open source for any sort of community reasons. We open sourced because we wanted the freemium strategy. We wanted to drive adoption. We wanted to drive dollars. And, investors love this. And they love that lock-in angle. This is a quote that I've used several times before. You talk about analysts, they praise stickiness in the open source database space. They praise the stickiness that Mongo has generated because they actually say most companies tend to stick to their database vendor over time, even if the vendor raised prices. And they say this is a great model. Just look at how wonderful Oracle was in the 90s. I don't know about you, but in the tech space, Oracle was not great for me in the 90s. Maybe it was for shareholders. Again, not generated for the users. And as you start to look at these companies and these investment dollars that come in, a lot of that change, a lot of that focus on driving business and additional dollars is based on the management team. If you go look at the big companies that have been changing their licensing and going more away from open source, look at where the pedigree of their management and executive teams come from. There isn't a lot of open source companies in this list. Because you know what? They don't want revenue from an open source company. They want revenue from a big proprietary company, but X amount more based on that open source adoption. So you get people coming from the Oracles or the VMs or the LinkedIns or the, IBMs or the, Bonds, Citrix, all these different companies that have driven, traditional business models and try to overlay that into the open source space. And that erodes what was originally a community-driven play. And what's funny is if you look specifically in the database space, these companies that even as they've made these changes, they're trying to become more profitable because the tricks that worked in the traditional business models, in the traditional spaces for open source or for proprietary companies aren't working here. So they are chasing and throwing dollars away at trying to become profitable. Okay, they make a lot of money, a lot of sales, but they are continuing to evolve and try and come up with a profitable business model. I like to call this from the shareholder perspective, it's the eventual profitability model, just like eventual consistency, right? Seems kind of like a fitting model, I guess, right? That, that databases companies would follow that as well. But this has generated this whole licensing whack-a-mole, if you will, right? And so you want to have a company that can have quote-unquote stickiness, or that can make people want to, purchase support or software. So you start with that GPL. And if you contribute or change it, well, then you have to contribute it back so everyone benefits. Oh, well, the cloud came along and kind of disrupted that because the cloud doesn't actually distribute it. So, we're going to create the AGPL. Oh, it didn't really work that much. Database as a service, software as a service continue to grow. Okay, let's go SSPL. Let's do anti-cloud type licensing. And so you have this whack-a-mole that continues to happen. You have this constant change for the sake of change. But this doesn't exist just here. This is a classic business model. And when you look at classic business models, you can apply the classic business model, issues and problems and kind of angst towards what's happening in the open source space. You don't believe me? Let's talk about ice cream. Okay. Now, in the US specifically, but I think everywhere in the world, you probably have seen the McDonald's ice cream cone machine. And there was this great article just in April of this year about McDonald's ice cream machines and the quote-unquote lock-in that happens with them. It turns out that when you have a McDonald's franchise, you have to buy the ice cream machine from one place. And that one place dictates all of the rules. Anytime there's a problem with the machine, you have to call them. You can never fix it yourself. You can't do anything without calling that vendor. Someone actually found that there was a secret code to get into the ice cream machine and fix the problems without having to call a vendor. So that way customers didn't have to wait for the vendor to come along and fix those issues. You know what happened? Well, McDonald's threatened lawsuits. They threatened all kinds of legal action against the people who found that code and anyone who used it, because they had an immense business working with this vendor. There was a lot of money flowing back and forth by having that unique proprietary contract. And that's the type of way that people are looking at open source. How do we lock people in? How do we protect our rights to fix this? Because if we are the only ones who can fix this, if we're the only ones who can distribute this, if we're the only ones who can make changes and features, then you know what? We can benefit more than everyone else. And that's where we're in this super dangerous time. The term open source is really being hijacked. It's being hijacked by a lot of different people. And, contributors are not being treated like the, awesome people that they are. How long are they going to want to continue to contribute if their code continually is placed under proprietary licenses or not fully open, or they're dictated to on how they can use the code that they've contributed and who owns it? And as we get into the next generation of developers, these developers are starting to think that these freemium models, these, half open source models, are the new standard, the new de facto way for people to develop software. So the next generation of open source software won't be open at all. And the issue is, as long as there's money out there and, potential, there's going to be these changes and there's going to be this erosion on what we classically call the freedom of open source. And as soon as that money starts to shut down, you know what? Investors are going to pull out even if there are good ideas. And this is going to potentially really hurt the industry as a whole. And, not only that, we're already seeing the erosion of innovation across the industry. Now, it's ironic that a lot of open source software, is what is used to develop these new proprietary softwares. If Lucene was released SSPL, Elastic wouldn't exist. So I leave you with this thought, right? We've got two battles going on here in the open source space, just like this Cherokee proverb. Okay, there's two wolves that are battling one another. One is jealousy, greed, anger, evilness. The other one's good. It's joy, it's peace, it's sharing. It's this great thing. Which one's going to win? And it's whichever one we feed. So however we treat the open source community, however we build our software, that's what's going to win. Thank you.